share a quote today that is going to be kind of the core of my talk, and it comes from one of the Discworld books. The Discworld books are a sprawling set of books. There are 41 of them, 41 novels. There's some other spin-offs too, by Terry Pratchett. And they're a combination of light fantasy and incisive social commentary, leaning more toward the first at the beginning and more toward the latter at the end, but mixed together in every book. I highly recommend all of them. If you're interested in getting started with the Discworld books, there are a lot of great places to start, not necessarily at the beginning. And I'll share a link with some recommended possible reading orders if you're interested in that at the end. In some of the books, the central character is the captain of the Ankh-Morpork City Guard, Sam Vimes. Here is a picture of him. Captain Vimes, here lighting a cigar with a small dragon. So there's some silliness here. We've got kind of this hard-bitten police officer, roughly, although it's not that well organized at first. And we see the development of this character through the books. In the 1993 book, Men at Arms, we find this thought from Captain Vimes. Sam Vimes' Boots theory of socioeconomic unfairness. The reason that the rich were so rich, Vimes reasoned, was because they managed to spend less money. Take Boots, for example. He earned $38 a month plus allowances. A really good pair of leather boots cost $50. But an affordable pair of boots, which were sort of okay for a season or two and then leaked like hell when the cardboard gave out, cost about $10. Those were the kind of boots Vimes always bought and wore until the soles were so thin that he could tell where he was in Ankh-Morpork on a foggy night by the feel of the cobbles. But the thing was that good boots lasted for years and years. A man who could afford $50 had a pair of boots that'd still be keeping his feet dry in 10 years' time, while the poor man, who could only afford cheap boots, would have spent $100 on boots in the same time and would still have wet feet. So that's the general principle we're talking about here. And while the book is fantasy, that principle is real, and it shows up in numerous ways that make poor people's lives disproportionately difficult, and which people with more resources may often be blissfully ignorant of. The general principle of the rich get richer and the poor get poorer is a really long-standing one. That particular quote is attributed to poet Percy Bysshe Shelley. He said of the political and economic policymakers of his time, "They have exemplified the saying, 'To him that hath, more shall be given, and from him that hath not, the little that he hath shall be taken away. The rich have become richer, and the poor have become poorer, and the vessel of the state is driven between the Scylla and Charybdis of anarchy and despotism.'" So he's quoting both the Bible and the Odyssey there, or alluding to them. It's a positive feedback loop. There are forces in society and in economics that lead to the rich continuing to get richer and the poor continuing to get poorer, spiraling in opposite directions. For a much longer example than Sam Vimes's little vignette, still well worth reading, fictional illustration of the high costs of being poor, try reading Les Miserables by Victor Hugo. For a less fictional one, read The Jungle by Upton Sinclair. It's a novel, but it's based on his observations in 7 weeks spent working in the Chicago meatpacking industry in the early 19th century. For a version that's not fictionalized at all, try reading Orwell's The Road to Wigan Pier, which is his grim accounting of coal miners' families' lives in his time. All of these books have some really vivid stories in them showing how people's choices are often forced by their poverty, and they're forced into worse conditions than they started in. Poverty is not only miserable, but actually expensive. So you're led to limited choices and greater poverty, and all of them lead us inexorably to the ethical principle that society should work to counter this effect rather than exacerbate it. So this positive feedback loop of the poor get poorer, got to wear the cheap boots because it's all you can afford, and then you spend more money on them. It shows up in many specific ways. Boots are just one. Boots are a real one. In the U.S. Consumer Affairs in 2013 published an article about boot prices. Children's boots bought from the retailer Finger Hut. You could buy a $25 pair of boots and pay interest on them that would cost $37 if you were paying on time payments, as many poor people are forced to do because they can't afford the full price up front. Other examples, well, I've got a lot of them. This is basically the concept of the cost of poverty. It is expensive to be poor because you can't take advantage of economic opportunities that rich people can, and there are actually extra costs to not having the money up front or to living in an environment forced by your poverty. One example, consumer finance. Payday lenders and pawn shops are way more expensive than credit cards and loans available to people with good credit. If you don't have money and you don't have a good credit history, you're going to pay more in interest on worse loans. And paying rent doesn't count toward good credit. You can pay rent for decades and not have anything show up on your credit. You can have been completely on time. You can have paid way more money in than someone paid on their mortgage, but someone who's paid off a house, they have great credit. And someone who's paid more in rent on time for the same amount of time gets nothing out of that. No equity, no credit history. If you are so broke that your bank account is empty, you get charged overdraft fees. You now have negative money. Small business loans and home loans are easier to get in richer neighborhoods. This is where the history of redlining comes in a lot of cities. Redlining was the practice of drawing a line around the poor neighborhood, usually a Black neighborhood, where people could not get home loans or other kinds of financial services, thus locking them into those neighborhoods, even if they personally did better financially. Healthcare. Poor people are less healthy for a lot of reasons. And there are fewer medical facilities and fewer pharmacies in their neighborhoods. So it's harder to get care, especially since they don't usually have good transportation either. They don't tend to have jobs that come with health insurance, and buying it privately can be really expensive and cover a lot less. If you are poor, you likely live in a neighborhood that doesn't have as many grocery stores. Poor neighborhoods can be food deserts. They can have no grocery stores at all. They could have just a convenience store, a gas station, a dollar store. And those stores sell at high prices per volume. They may have low prices like $1 a unit, but the unit is going to be smaller. They're going to sell lower quality, higher priced, more highly processed food. They're not likely to have fresh produce. They are likely to have lots of stuff with fat and preservatives and sugar and lots of processed starch. And you can't even economize by buying ingredients in bulk and cooking necessarily if you're poor, because if you don't have the cash flow, you can't buy in bulk. If you don't have the transportation, you can't go to Costco and stock up or take advantage of a sale. It may be a better deal if you can buy lots of it, but if you don't have the storage space, you don't have a car, you're not going to carry 5 boxes of Costco groceries on the bus or on your bike or on foot. There's no way you could do it. You don't have the storage space. You may not have the ability to cook. If you're homeless, you certainly don't. You may not have the equipment or the knowledge. You certainly may not have the time. If you are trying to work low-paying jobs, you may be working long hours and have no time for things like cooking or grocery shopping to some distant store. So you have to spend lots of money on small amounts of nutritionally inferior food, and that impacts your health as well as costing you money and time. Purchasing in general, if you can afford to pay in cash, you get the best prices. If you buy with a credit card and you don't pay it off every month, you're going to pay higher interest on your purchases. If you can't get credit or you rely on time payments, you're going to pay even more. You're going to pay for your purchases many times over if you're rent to owning on your furniture. Utility costs can be higher in low-income neighborhoods, maddeningly enough. Missing a payment can result in fees, rate hikes, spoiled food, that's more lost money and time, loss of heat or cooling or light, you could lose your job. If you don't have power, that might prevent you from doing your homework or doing some work at home. It has effects on your health and your sleep. All of these things can snowball. Every one of these pieces can affect the others. If you can't afford a reliable car or parking or repairs, and you need to rely on public transportation and walking, getting anywhere is going to take much, much longer. It may be impossible to get certain places. Maybe you can't get across town after 5 p.m. because that's when that particular bus stops. You're not going to be able to haul groceries or furniture or anything like that. To get a job in the first place, you have to have an address. You have to have ID. You have to have a place to shower and wash your clothes. You have to have decent clothes. You need a phone. You need reliable transportation. You may need childcare. All of those things, even if you manage to get a job, if you lose one of those things, you may lose the job, and it may be impossible to get one back again with that gap in your employment record and that missing piece to getting a new job. Taxes. Sales taxes are highly regressive. That means they affect the poorest people the most because poor people pay a larger proportion of their income for taxable goods as compared to rich people who often spend a lot of money on investments, things that are not taxed in the same way. They spend a very small proportion on actual goods and services for their daily lives. States have moved to raise sales taxes even higher and cutting more progressive income taxes. In the 50s, we had far more progressive income taxes. We were charging rich people a higher proportion of their income, not just charging them more, but charging them a higher percentage because they can afford a higher percentage. They don't need nearly as much of their income to live on. The poorest people pay no taxes, but we can broaden that spectrum and increase the taxes at the higher end far, far more than we currently do. Government services. There are often government services for poor people and people who are missing certain kinds of assets. But they can be really hard to access for the people who most need them. People with no time, money, transportation, or education are often required to make multiple trips to an office across town, fill out paperwork, produce records that they may not have, and generally jump through hoops that may be more difficult for them than for people with more resources. Education. School funding is usually based on property taxes. What this means is if you live in a rich neighborhood, the tax base is high, your school is well funded, it can afford lots of services like counselors and nurses and coaches. If you live in a poor neighborhood, there's not as much of a tax base. So the kids in the poor neighborhoods who need more remediation and more social services and more free lunches and more homework help, those kids are getting the least services because their neighborhoods can't afford it. Insurance. Poor people often can't afford insurance of all kinds. That means that any kind of accident or bad luck that a rich person would easily weather because insurance would pay it, it can wreck them. The justice system. We have this lovely quote from Anatole France. The law, in its majestic equality, forbids rich and poor alike to sleep under bridges, to beg in the streets, and to steal their bread. Even if the laws are the same for rich and poor people, they're going to affect poor people more because poor people are the ones who end up committing these things that get defined as crimes. If you're starving and you steal a loaf of bread, now you're starving and a criminal. Great. If you're rich, it's not even going to occur to you to steal a loaf of bread. And honestly, if you do, you'll probably get off because you can afford an expensive lawyer. Poor people are more likely to be fined or jailed than wealthy people for the same crime. They tend to get longer sentences. Well, they tend to be sentenced. They tend to get longer sentences. And if they're fined, the flat fine is way more for them than for a rich person. There are ways to counter this. In Finland and in some other countries, they make fines proportional to income. So a poor person who speeds might owe €6. A millionaire who speeds was charged 130,000 euros. So it's actually proportional to the amount of income they make on an average day. That makes a huge difference. Most places are not doing that. Most places, you have this fine. It's nothing for a poor person, which essentially means it's not even illegal. I mean, it's nothing for the rich person, which essentially means it's not illegal for the rich person because there's no meaningful consequence for them, whereas it's extremely expensive for a poor person. In addition to all that, ex-cons have a lot of difficulty getting jobs. So you can see how this can continue to perpetuate both poverty and crime. If you don't have other options, you may commit more crimes. Anti-homeless measures, such as laws against sleeping in public, throwing out the contents of tent camps. This results in fines, jail times, and loss of their meager possessions for people who can least afford it. If you lose your change of clothing, you might lose your job. If you lose your phone, ID, or paperwork, you may lose your connection to social services. You now can't get anything. Either of these could go on to result in death for someone who's already in a very marginal existence. Losing your medications because the camp got swept and they all got thrown out, that could kill someone directly. I'm sure it has many times. A person who's already poor and they hit a financial crisis, a pregnancy, an illness, a car breakdown, loss of a job, being robbed, has very few options to resolve it, and all of them are likely to be expensive and time-consuming and create further financial strain in the future. So we have this spiral where if you're poor, you spiral down, you get poorer. If you're rich, you spiral up, you get richer. I've talked more about the poor side because that was the point today. But given this positive feedback loop that pushes poor people harder into poverty, and that some kinds of public policies can make it worse, are there social, political, and economic policies that can make it better? Yes, there are. Where unregulated capitalism exacerbates this loop, progressive policies can counter it. Economic progressivism is based on the idea that if you have unregulated capitalism, that is inherently unfair. It favors big businesses, rich people, large corporations. Progressives believe a fair market should result in a normal distribution of wealth, the bell curve. But in real life, it tends to skew toward wealth is accumulated by the rich and disappears from the poor. So specific economic policies that are considered progressive to help reverse that effect and flatten things out a little bit more are progressive taxes. So we want income taxes that are proportionally more on the rich and not sales taxes. We want income redistribution measures that are aimed at reducing inequality. Universal health care, universal public education available, Social Security, minimum wage laws, antitrust laws, workers' rights, labor unions, and welfare services available. The fundamental purpose of a society is to cooperate to increase human potential and reduce suffering. We have a responsibility as humans and as members of our neighborhood, our city, our state, our nation, and our world to reduce the harsh consequences of poverty on the least powerful members of society and help them find ways out of it. When we know that forces exist that push people further into poverty, misery, and harm, it is our duty to ameliorate and reverse these effects through our actions as neighbors and as citizens. May we all have character arcs as transformative as Pratchett's characters and learn to be as compassionate as Pratchett. Here's Pratchett himself. Here we go. We can finish with him.